Shalom.
Whoops. I apologize for that. The timer's going to count down in a moment. Hello, my holy sisters and brothers. I apologize. I was just holding the phone because I always had to turn down the volume as this song is ending and the show is beginning, and I somehow hit the wrong button. But that was, up until 10 seconds ago, Moshe Storch singing Kianu Amecha. It's a song we sing at Yom Kippur. We say, because we are your nation and you are our God. We are your people and you are our king. It's a beautiful song we sing as we take on and submit to the sovereignty of God in our lives. Let's light up the darkness. Who is going to be with us on this lovely Thursday evening? It's Moadim L'Simcha. We're in the intermediate days of Sukkot. Tonight, actually, we're entering Hoshana Rabbah, the last day of Sukkot, the sort of, it's a sort of the highest moment of the rejoicing. And then Friday night begins a separate holiday that is sort of attached to Sukkot, but is not Sukkot, and is Shmini Atzeret. Maybe we'll say a little bit more about that tomorrow. Who's with us this evening? Melissa from Great Neck, New York, Yehuda from Florence, South Carolina, James from Indianapolis, Ed from New Jersey, Stephen from New Hampshire, Pam from Nashville, Grace from Miami. If this is your first time joining us, please let us know so we can welcome you. Nancy from North Carolina, Patrice from Utah, Brinna says Hag Sameach, Tom from Pennsylvania, Libby from Georgia. Tom is in Pennsylvania saying Shalom again. Lucy from Minneapolis, Amy from Maryland, Carl from Arizona, Paul, Shalom and good evening from Minneapolis. Anna says Pitkatova. Bill Eldridge says, Shalom everyone. If any are willing, please pray for my family's discernment. We've decided to try and keep my grandmother in her own home instead of moving her, and that's going to require a lot of planning on our parts. May you all have tremendous illumination as you make these important decisions for your family. Bill, your heart is so big. I'm sure you're going to do what's right for your grandmother, without a doubt, and God will help you do it. But we pray for your strength in that, and we say Amen. Hal, with us from the Gulf Coast in Florida. Tom says that's one of my favorite songs. Amy is offering prayers to Bill. Beautiful. Anne is with us from Merced. Celeste is with us from Seattle. And she says she was born in Merced. And over on the YouTube side, Marasi is with us from Georgia. Meggie Scott says Shalom from Ostrander, Ohio. Erev Tov Sal. Erev Tov to you. Eduardo Santucci says Shalom, bendiciones desde Montevideo, Uruguay. Bienvenido, Eduardo. Qué bueno que estás con nosotros. And Lynn is with us from Texas. All right, where are we holding? Hopefully, if you had a chance, I did a Hallel show this morning from our sukkah. So if you didn't get a chance to partake in Hallel where you are, I mean, it's not like the way we like to do Hallel every day, a big group of us together singing at the top of our lungs. It's just me and the sukkah. But it's still an obligation, a commandment for Jews to recite Hallel every day of Sukkot. And I tried to go a little deeper into the Psalms and teachings of Sukkot. So that's in the news feed at Accidental Talmudist on Facebook. Right. So in our Daf Yomi journey, we are in the midst of a 7.5-year journey. We're in about 270 some odd days into it. We're in the third volume of the Talmud, Eruvin, the laws of Shabbos boundaries and joining courtyards. We're in chapter 5, which is all about the laws of whole cities and measuring and planning out and regulating the Shabbos boundaries for a city. We recall that a person is allowed to walk 2,000 cubits on Shabbos from his dwelling in any direction. But if he lives in a city, then the whole city counts as his dwelling. And yesterday we were looking at, we talked so much about, how big is the measure and where do we measure from and what shape should the city be and when we square a city and when we don't. But yesterday we got into, how did they actually measure it? It's not a hypothetical, thing at all. This is practical laws that they really enacted in ancient times, and they still do in certain cities, but in Jewish communities, right, where the majority of the people are observant Jews, and they want to know how far they can walk out of the city on Shabbos. I don't know if modern communities do this in Israel. I wouldn't be surprised. If you know more about that, please let us know in the comments. But certainly in ancient times, they measured the Shabbos boundary and they marked the roads during the week, obviously, so that people would know on Shabbos how far they could walk as they were leaving the city. And there were a lot of rules, and it was difficult, right? It was not simple to know how to measure the Shabbos boundary. Depending on the shape of the city, that could affect the shape of the boundary and where you measure from, etc., how to deal with canyons and hills and obstructions like fences. So it's no surprise when we reach today's daf, and this is daf Nun Tes, page 59 in Tractate Eruvin. We're going to start a new Mishnah today. So this is Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 5. And it really is no surprise after we saw how complex it was to measure these Shabbos boundaries and what was involved for the people doing the measuring and their 50-cubit rope, etc., that in today's Mishnah we learn that you should not do this yourself. That you don't just get a few guys together from the city, let's go out and measure. In fact, when you're determining the Shabbos boundary for a city of people that are going to rely on these boundaries so that they don't come to violate the rabbinic ordinance concerning Shabbos boundary and how far we may walk on Shabbos, you should only rely on the measurements of an expert. The measurements of an expert. Our Mishnah today says, let's read the Mishnah. This is Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 5. One may measure the Shabbos limit only with an expert surveyor. By the way, you hear me being a little sing-song. This is it's an important sort of attribute of Talmud study. You hear it all the time if you go to a Daf Yomi class or anyone teaching sugyot, they're not called verses, but teachings, right? When somebody is sharing a teaching from the Talmud, they will get into that sing-song voice. Why? Because very often, there's a lot of complex concepts that are being strung together. And you want to make sure that people know when you're beginning and when you're ending the teaching. And so that sing-song nature allows people to listen for, okay, that's the whole teaching. Or no, he's not done with the teaching yet. There's another part that I need in order to understand the teaching. So that's why we get into that sing-song voice. At any rate, one may measure the Shabbos limit only with an expert surveyor. If it is discovered that the surveyor extended the limit in one place and reduced it in another place, so that the line marking the Shabbos limit is not straight, one accepts the measurement of the place where he extended the limit and straightens the limit accordingly. Similarly, if the surveyor extended the limit for one and reduced it for another, one accepts the extended measurement. And furthermore, even if a slave or a maidservant who are not Jewish and whose testimonies are not considered reliable for other kinds of matters, for this matter, they are trusted to say that the Shabbos limit extended until here, right? If the markings are gone, but we need sort of people who have been here for a long time and they remember where the markings were, we trust them to say it as long as they're an adult, whether they're Jewish or not, whether they're free or not, though we don't do it with a minor. As they extend, are trustworthy to say the Shabbos limit extended until here. As the sages did not state the matter, meaning the laws of Shabbos limits, to be stringent, but rather to be lenient. The prohibition to walk more than 2,000 cubits is rabbinic in origin and is therefore interpreted leniently. So that is our Mishnah. We're going to have another Mishnah today as well. We're going to be doing 2 Mishnahs with God's help. Mishnahs number 4 and 5. But this one, we just learned that we need an expert to conduct the survey. Right? And sometimes the markings just wear out over time, or somehow they get damaged, or a storm comes, or whatever happens, the markings disappear, or people neglect it for a long time, and then someone comes along and says, hey, the markings are not clear. Maybe we need to measure again and make sure that they're accurate. Or the city has changed, right? We've said that we'll extend the city limits if there are houses kind of outboard of what the city limit was, as long as they're within 70 and 2/3 cubits of what the city limit was. Now we're going to grow the city. So when we grow the city, we're going to need to grow the Shabbos boundary as well, because you get 2,000 cubits of permitted walking on Shabbos from the city limits outward away from the city. So from time to time, they need to resurvey. And when you do that, you bring in an expert. Okay. Now the Gemara starts to analyze this Mishnah, and it says, okay, so the expert, they bring in an expert, and his opinion is accepted to extend or to reduce, right? So if he extends, if he makes the Shabbos, if he makes the limit of how far one can walk on Shabbos further away from the city than it used to be, so this is increasing the leniency. In other words, now we can walk farther on Shabbos than previously. If he reduces it, that's a stringency. And that can happen, right? Because maybe some residences were bulldozed. A part of the city that used to be there is no longer there. And now the city contracts, and so does the Shabbos limit for walking. So that also can happen. So we accept his opinion to extend and to reduce. And it can also happen that maybe the city shifts a little bit, or maybe the previous measurement was off, and now a bigger expert, right, a better surveyor comes, and he says, well, no, actually, your markings were off. And he makes changes, then he extends in one area, reduces in another. We accept all of that. And if he only extends, right, only comes to make it bigger, which would make sense if the city grew, but even if the city didn't grow, right, even if it's like a walled city and the walls of the city haven't changed and no additional residences have been added in the vicinity of the city, and he extends it anyway, that is accepted, right? So this is to teach us, as it said there, the laws of the Shabbos limit were created by the rabbis, and we're only to be lenient. That's what the Mishnah says. In fact, we're going to have a conflict with that aspect of the Mishnah. But first, so it says we're going to be lenient in all these matters. Even if he only extends the limit, we're going to accept what the surveyor said. And certainly if he reduces it, we're going to accept what he said because he's the expert. That's why we brought him in. However, when do we become suspicious that the expert we brought in is not such an expert, right? So if he extends it a little, great. We're going to have a little bit more room that we can walk around in on Shabbos. But if he extends it a lot and the city hasn't changed, so that's problematic, right? Did we have such a poor excuse for measurements before that this guy's going to come in and make a really large change? So, how big a change can this new expert make, and we're fine and accept whatever he says? And the answer is 585 cubits. Odd number, right? It is an odd number, but an interesting number. Where do we get 585 cubits, right? So 585 cubits comes like this. All right, so I'm going to draw the city twice. Okay, and it's a squared city, right? So that's the same city. I'm drawing it twice. But the first time, what they did is they made a mistake and they measured the 2,000 cubits from the corner. They're not supposed to do that. They're supposed to measure from the side to... I'm getting new magic markers, so I apologize that this one is so sloppy. You're supposed to measure from the side. When you measure from the side, and then you make a nice big square around the city, then in the corner, you end up with 2,800, right? So if you measure from the side 2,000 in every direction, then the Shabbos limit ends up being 2,000 cubits away from the sides of the city and 2,800 into the corner. Right, into the corner. But if he made a mistake and he measured 2,000 from the corner, then it's going to be a smaller Shabbos boundary. This is just the same city drawn twice. But when he measured 2,000 from the corner, then right over here, this ends up, the math of it is 1415, right? Then the side measure would end up being 1415, and the difference between 2,000 and 1415 is 585. In other words, if this guy comes and he says that there's more than a 585, if it's within 585, then what we're going to say is, oh, you know what? Previously, it was smaller because they measured 2,000 cubits from the corner of the city instead of from the side of the city. And the new expert knows better, and he's teaching us that we measure from the side, and so we're going to gain this 585 cubits that we should have had all along. But if we gain more than that, then we're like, oh, this guy's suspicious. He's adding too much to the city for no good reason. Now we have to go get yet another expert to check the results of this expert that we brought in. We said in the Mishna that, and let me read that language again. It's important language. That the sages did not state the laws of Shabbos limits to be stringent, but rather to be lenient. That's what it said in the Mishnah. Now, the Gemara brings a baraisa from the same period as the Mishnah, which says exactly the opposite. And the baraisa says the sages did not state the laws of Shabbos limits to be lenient, but rather to be stringent. It seems like it totally conflicts this. What does that mean? And is it Abaye that reconciles the two? Ravina. And then Ravina reconciles these, right? So Ravina and Rav Ashi are the editors of the Talmud, or the editors of the Gemara. And Ravina explains the reason that one says the sages stated the matter, Shabbos boundary, to be lenient, and that's the Mishnah, and the Baraisa says the sages stated the matter of Shabbos limits in order to be stringent. How can we reconcile these two statements? Ravina tells us, no. It is they did state the matter of Shabbos limits, how far we can walk on Shabbos, to be more stringent than the Torah, right? Because the Torah doesn't spell out how far we're allowed to walk on Shabbos. But as we've seen before, the Torah did say that on Shabbos, a person will remain in their place, right? It was talking about not going out to gather the manna, but it was not talking about we're confined to our tents. So what does it mean, stay in your place? And, a few weeks ago, we had that derivation of how they ended up with the number of 2,000. They are more stringent than the Torah, but only because the Torah doesn't spell it out. And the sages said, well, how do we follow the law to stay in our place? We needed to figure that out, and so they did. But since it was the rabbis who figured out how far we can go, we're not going to be more stringent than what the rabbis say. That's why we don't multiply laws. Even though the Talmud has grown huge, it's not because first the rabbis draw a fence around the Torah to make sure we don't violate a precept of the Torah, and then the later rabbis draw a fence around the laws of earlier rabbis, and then it's just more and more laws increased upon us. It doesn't work that way, right? Once the sages have made a law to protect us from violating the Torah, those laws are going to be interpreted leniently so that they don't multiply and overly burden the people with additional obligations that would end up resting on their shoulders. And that is our discussion of Mishnah number 4. We move on to Mishnah number 5 here of chapter 5, and let's read that Mishnah. Which is interesting. What this Mishnah is, we've been talking about the laws of Shabbos limits, how far a person can walk on Shabbos. We sort of left behind what was a discussion of chapters, mostly of chapters 1 and 2 and even 3, which was about joining courtyards, right? Shabbos limits, or the Shabbos boundary, the techumim in Hebrew, that's all about how far we can walk. Joining courtyards is not about how far we can walk, but where we can carry on Shabbos and where we can't. It is prohibited to carry in the public domain more than 4 cubits at a time. But in a private domain, I can carry things. I can pick them up and walk around and carry them. So when we join private domains together into a larger private domain, then the area that we can carry on Shabbos grows. This is called the joining of courtyards. This Mishnah now, Mishnah number 5 of chapter 5, is going to, even though the first 4 Mishnahs were all about the Shabbos boundaries of cities, now we're going to talk about joining courtyards within a city. Why? Why is it in this chapter? Because these laws affect whole cities. That's why. So here's the Mishnah. Although, and Rav Steinsaltz introduces by saying, although this chapter as a whole deals with the halachas, the laws governing the joining of Shabbos boundaries, this Mishnah returns to the halachas governing the joining of courtyards. If a private city, which does not have many residents, grows and becomes a heavily populated public city, one may establish a joining of the courtyards for all of it, for the whole city, as long as it does not include a public domain as defined by Torah law. This is very interesting. If a private city grows into a public city, we can join all of the courtyards within it, as long as that city doesn't include a public domain as defined by Torah law. And usually a public domain is defined by Torah law. It's not just, what's not in my house, right? A public domain is more like a thoroughfare where a lot of people walk every day, like 600,000 people walk, right? And that's a major thoroughfare. That's a particular kind of public domain. And if a public city loses residents over time and becomes a private city, one may not establish an eruv for all of it unless one maintains an area outside the eruv that is like the size of the city of Hadashah in Judea, which has 50 residents, right? So if a public city gets reduced and ends up becoming like a smaller city, like you'd think of it as a private city, and so it would seem to make sense that, we'll just call the whole city one, we'll make an eruv around the whole city, and it's just one big private domain. The sages say in such a city where it used to be a bigger city and now it has become smaller, okay, you can join all of the city into one eruv in chatzeiros, into one joining of the courtyards, but there has to be an area that's sizable enough for 50 people to live there, which gets excluded from the citywide eruv. Why? And the reason for this requirement is to ensure that the laws of eruv will not be forgotten. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon says the excluded area need not be so large. Rather, it is sufficient to exclude 3 courtyards with 2 houses each. Isn't that interesting? Right? That if a big city becomes smaller, and it would make sense to just join all of it in one eruv, it would be the easiest thing to do. The sages say, yeah, you can do that, but you still have to leave a little piece out of it. There's going to be a piece of that city where people are not going to be allowed to carry on Shabbos. It has to be excluded from the larger eruv so that people understand. And it can even be, I think that you could even make an eruv in that smaller area. It just can't be included in the bigger citywide eruv. Why? So that people will notice the koras and lechis, the cross beams and side posts, which create the joining of courtyards, so that they will know that the reason they're carrying on Shabbos is not because you're allowed to carry on Shabbos generally, but rather because an eruv was made for this city. And they should be aware of these laws and aware that arrangements have been made for them so that they'll study these laws and they will not be forgotten. Yes. And so all of this, so this in this Mishnah number 5 here in chapter 5. So this is all based on the fact that cities grow and shrink. So much of what we study, like we just think about it as from some long ago time, but in our minds, that long ago time was one time, as if all the sages lived at the same time, but they didn't. They were living and teaching and learning and exchanging these views over hundreds of years. hundreds of years, right? America is not even 250 years old, is it? No, in the year 2026, it'll be 250 years old. America's not even 250 years old. These sages were working out these laws, over a period of 700 or 800 years, and the kingdom of Israel stood for 1,200 years. I mean, it's like, and things changed over that time. And so that's why even laws that were one way for earlier sages got modified over time as conditions changed and the sages came to understand it better. And they had the time over these centuries to observe how the world changes, how cities grow and cities shrink, and that there have to be laws for that situation of growing and shrinking cities. So the law is, in this situation, this is the halacha, spelled out in the Gemara. The sages taught in a baraisa, if a private city becomes public, so this is a city that grew. It was a small private city, not just small, maybe it was even owned, the whole city was owned by one person, but it was like a community, or they owned the community, but then more and more people started coming, and it became not just that there were more, not just a larger area, and that there were more people there, but when cities grow past a certain size, their nature changes. Like, I don't mean trees and forests around them. I mean the nature, the personality of the city changes once it grows past a certain size. The city government is different. The city services are different. You don't know everybody that lives in your community. It changes, right? So if a private city becomes public and a bona fide public domain passes through it, right? So a bona fide public domain means a big thoroughfare that at least has the possibility of 600,000 people walking along it from time to time. How does one establish an eruv for it? He places a side post from here, one side of the public domain, and a side post from there, the other side, and he places a cross beam from here on one side of the public domain and another cross beam from there. Now, we've seen this before, that how do we make it possible to carry in a bona fide public domain, which is a big, busy thoroughfare? How is it going to be possible to carry there on Shabbos? It's like the definition of a public domain, right? And it's not within a citywide eruv. So then you have to really mark the parts of that public domain that are going to be suitable for carrying on Shabbos with a very visible side post and crossbeam. And some of the sages even said there needs to be doors on either end of that big thoroughfare. And he may then carry items and place them between these symbolic partitions, as the public domain is now considered like one of the courtyards of the city. And here's the key. And one may not establish an eruv for half the city. Rather, one may establish either one eruv for all of it, or separate ones for each alleyway separately, without including the other sections of the city. So what we've got is this situation where a city grew, and let's see if you can see that. The city grew, and it went from being small to being large. But there is this like avenue that goes right through the middle of it from side to side, and that's the public thoroughfare. And what we're being told here is, okay, you can make an eruv for the whole city, and you have to be careful how you account for what goes on in that public thoroughfare. But what you cannot do is use the public thoroughfare that goes through the middle as the border of an eruv that only includes half the city, right? Either that upper half of the city or the lower half of the city. You cannot do that. Why? Why can't you make an eruv for, let's just call it north and south, upper and lower, for the northern half of the city and not for the southern half? Because that big public thoroughfare, people are going to be walking down it all the time, right? They're going to be mixing there. And if that thoroughfare is included in the eruv of the upper half of the city, but the lower half of the city is not included in that eruv, then you're going to be mixing people on that thoroughfare, some of whom can carry on Shabbos and some of whom cannot. And that situation is untenable. Now, Rav Papa says, okay, we may not establish an eruv for half the city if the division is that thoroughfare itself in the middle. But if you divide the city from side to side, right, like that, where you see the thoroughfare runs from, think of it as east-west, right, from side to side through the middle of the city. But now the division between the halves of the city is going to run from top to bottom, north-south. So each half of the city, each half that has one half has an eruv, one half doesn't, right? But both halves of the city have access to that thoroughfare. And in the half of the city that has the eruv, right, then everyone who's using that thoroughfare is in the eruv. And in the other half of the city that's not in the eruv, everyone who's using that thoroughfare is not part of the eruv. So now you don't have this mixing of people on the same busy street, some of whom have the right to carry on Shabbos and some of them do not. So Rav Papa says we permit this, right? We permit that kind of division that we can have. We can't have half the city in the eruv as long as the division goes up and down, whereas the public thoroughfare runs from side to side. The Gemara objects and says, now wait a minute, this doesn't work. It doesn't work because of a teaching we have from Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says if you have a situation where there are two adjacent courtyards, and one is an inner courtyard and one is an outer courtyard. Okay, so here, it's a little small. I don't know if you can see this drawing. But here, if you look at that, there's two courtyards, right? The upper courtyard is considered the inner courtyard, and the lower one is the outer courtyard. Why? Because the residents of the upper courtyard, in order to leave, these two courtyards and go out to the street and go on their way into the rest of the city, they have to pass through the lower courtyard, which is why it's the outer courtyard. So these two courtyards should definitely make an eruv together. If for some reason they don't want to cooperate, they're neighbors, but they don't want to cooperate, and the people in the upper courtyard have their eruv so that the houses join together in that courtyard so they can carry throughout their courtyard, but they don't join with the residents of the lower outer courtyard and make a big eruv for everybody. Okay, so then what would happen? The people who live in that inner courtyard can carry in their courtyard, but when they walk through the outer courtyard to get out to the rest of the city, they're not allowed to carry there. The people in that outer courtyard are allowed to carry in their own courtyard, but they're going to be mixing with people who are walking through their courtyard, who have to walk through their courtyard, who have a right to walk through their courtyard, but who are not allowed to carry there. And because in this same space, you're going to have people who have rights to it, right? The people in that upper courtyard have an easement, right? They have a right of way through the outer courtyard because otherwise they'd be in prison. And yet they can't carry there. So because they have a right to go through there, but they are not joined in the eruv, so they're not allowed to carry there, that actually invalidates the eruv of the outer courtyard, not only for the residents of the inner courtyard, but even for the people who live in the outer courtyard. Nobody can carry there. And so that's why the sages, through this ruling, they create a policy, right? This is government issuing a policy that neighbors have to work together, right? Because otherwise it's just not going to work. So applying this principle to the city, now, right, if we have people mixing who can walk through the thoroughfare and carry, mixing with people who can walk in that thoroughfare and not carry, it should invalidate this whole system of the eruv, right? So even according to Rav Papa, who says we can divide, because now people who are using the public thoroughfare in the middle, they don't need to mix with each other, but they can mix with each other. It's not like the thoroughfare is closed off. It's just a question of who can carry there and who can't. So they have a choice. They don't have to walk down that thoroughfare to leave the city if there are exits on both sides of the thoroughfare. But nonetheless, the fact that people are going to be mixing is problematic, and that's why this objection is brought from the teaching of Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara will say, yeah, but they have a choice. They don't have to walk through there in the same way that the residents of the inner courtyard must walk through the outer courtyard. Very good. So then there's an alternative version brought where Rav Papa says, so right, this often happens, especially when it's a baraisa. The Mishnas, we have authoritative versions of them. That's why they're Mishnas. But sometimes it happens with baraisas that we have two versions of the baraisa. They weren't sure, and that's probably why the particular baraisa wasn't included in the Mishnah. And that happens here. We have another version of the same baraisa where Rav Papa says, no, you can't divide the city in half. You can't divide it lengthwise, and you can't divide it from top to bottom either. If there's one public thoroughfare, and it's for this reason that people are going to end up mixing on the same thoroughfare, some can carry and some can't. So that's why either you have an eruv for the whole city, or you just have localized eruvs for where we join alleyways and courtyards, and those are going to be clearly marked. But you can't have half the city, even if the division between what's an eruv and what's not bisects that public thoroughfare rather than runs along it. That's in the alternative version of the baraisa. So then the Gemara asks, well, okay, in that case, if you can't do it because people are mixing on that public thoroughfare, then why are we allowed to have even localized eruvs? Why can't we join a few courtyards together? Because when you join a few courtyards together, and let's say, the residents of those 3 blocks over there, and, they've joined their alleyways together, and all those people can carry in that neighborhood. And the people in this neighborhood, they join a few blocks together and set out markings with side posts and cross beams, etc. And they make an area where they can carry. And so that's for them, and this is for them. And they're definitely separate. But it's possible that on Shabbos, somebody, who doesn't live in either neighborhood will walk into that neighborhood, and he doesn't have a right to carry in that neighborhood. And somebody who's over here, he's not part of that eruv, so he can carry in his neighborhood, but if he walks over to that neighborhood, he can't carry over there. So we have this same mixing problem. Why doesn't it invalidate even these localized neighborhood eruvs for the same reason of Rabbi Akiva's holding? And the Gemara answers its own question. It doesn't invalidate them because they're clearly marked and everyone knows where they stand. Over here, this eruv is for this group, this eruv is for that group, and when you're leaving your eruv and going somewhere else, and you could carry within that eruv, but you can't leave. And I'm not even sure if you can carry when you go to somebody else's eruv, unless maybe you're their guest. But if you're just walking through, it's a different question. We have to think a little bit more about that. But the main point is we do allow localized neighborhood eruvs because they're clearly marked. That's the key. They're clearly marked. Okay. Very good. Very good. We have a baraisa that says, if a public city that remained public, okay, so we've talked now about private cities that grew into public cities and public cities that shrunk into private cities. But now a city that was always a public city and it remained a public city, so this has always been a public place, it's always been a city of a certain size, and it only has one entrance to the public domain. So it has a major thoroughfare that is inside the city, but it only has one entrance. So you can imagine it's like a walled city that has one entrance, and that one entrance to the whole city leads onto like the main street of the city, and it runs through the middle of the city. But at the other end of the city, there's not another gate in the city wall. There's only one entrance. So in that kind of a case, the law is that we can make an eruv for the whole city, but we're supposed to exclude some part of the city. Rabbi Zera established an eruv in Rabbi Chia's city for the whole city, and he did not exclude, right? We're supposed to exclude just a little area. One of the sages said an area that 50 people can live there, and somebody else said, I think it was Rabbi Yehuda said 50 people, and Rabbi Shimon said it's enough of just 3 courtyards with 2 houses each. But at any rate, you have to leave a little part out of the main city eruv so that people will come to ask, oh, why is that? The law is different over there. Why is that? Oh, it's the law of eruv, and they excluded a part. And it'll be like a practical demonstration of Torah law in action, rabbinic law in action, that people will come to ask and wonder about it. And so the law of eruv, not only will it not be forgotten, but it will prompt further Torah discussion. But here we have a case where Rabbi Zera went to Rabbi Chia's city. It's like he was the expert who was brought in to do this. And he established a citywide eruv, and he didn't exclude any little neighborhood from it. And Abaye asked Rabbi Zera, why? Why didn't you exclude some little portion of the city according to this ruling of the Mishna, which says you have to leave a little part out so that the law of eruv won't be forgotten? And by the way, we're coming to the end of what I'm going to teach, so if you have comments or questions, please put them in now. We'd love to discuss that. If you're a first-timer, would love to welcome you. I'm going to come to that in just a few minutes. So Rabbi Zera said to Abaye, well, the elders of the city told me that Rav Chiya bar Asi used to make an eruv for the whole city without excluding any area. And so I conclude that this wasn't always a public city that remained a public city, but at some point in this city's history, it was a much smaller city. It was a private city, and it grew into a public city. And when we have a private city that grows into a public city, we can make a citywide eruv, and we don't have to exclude some little part of it. And that's why I did it this way. Abaye says to Rabbi Zera, the same elders who told you that Rabbi Chiya used to do it this way, or that Rav Chiya bar Asi used to do it this way, if you had talked to them a little bit more, if you had interviewed them a little bit more thoroughly, you would have heard some additional details. Namely, that this city, which has a major thoroughfare that runs through the middle of it, that only has one entrance, right, in the city wall, actually has 2 entrances. There are 2 entrances to that thoroughfare, one at each end of the city. In Rav Chiya bar Asi's time, one of those entrances was closed by a garbage dump that piled up in front of that entrance. But years later, they cleaned up that garbage dump and exposed that entrance, and now we have a main thoroughfare that runs with 2 entrances, one at each end. So now we have the situation of a big public city with a thoroughfare that has entrances at both ends, and in that situation, you can make a citywide eruv, but you need to leave a little piece open so that people will not forget the law of eruv. And Rabbi Zera says, oh, I was not aware. I was wrong, and thank you for bringing it to my attention. And I would have to say, that is a classic case. Obviously Rabbi Zera was a mensch. He was a real mensch, and he was perfectly willing to admit when he was wrong. But how did it happen that somebody is careful and pious and diligent and attentive to detail as Rabbi Zera came to make a mistake that Abaye was able to unearth? And both of them got their information from where? From the elders of the city, by having a conversation with the elders of the city. Both had a conversation with the elders of the city, and yet they came away from that conversation with different facts about the city, both of which were true, but Rabbi Zera's version was incomplete because he didn't have a deep enough conversation. And I would have to say that what Rabbi Zera experienced was confirmation bias. He had an impression of what this city was. He had an impression of what it was that Rabbi Chiya was doing in the past. Well, I guess Rav Chiya bar Asi. And, as soon as he got the information that confirmed what he already expected to hear, he got busy. He didn't have a lot of time, and he just wanted to get the job done. Abaye was a little bit more methodical, not just in doing his research, but in interviewing the witnesses, as it were, right? So it's a great lesson to all of us that when, we're sort of making a plan about how we're going to build something or how we're going to do a job, how we're going to create a project, create an enterprise, etc., that's going to affect a lot of people. When we go into our listening phase, our research phase of talking to people and finding out, how things have been done in the past, how they're being done now, what it is that people are looking for, how people will be affected, that whole societal impact report, as it were, we have to really spend time talking to people and not just as soon as we've heard the answers that we expect to hear, go, yep, just as I thought, write it down and get on with it, because we could really end up making a mistake that would impact those same people later, and they would come to rely on our opinion to their detriment. And so Rabbi Zera was quite thankful to Abaye for being a little bit more methodical in those interviews with the elders of the city. Let's check comments and questions. Whoa, what happened here? Hold on, let me just get that in front of me. It's so weird. Google signed me out of the sheet that Nina and I use. Okay, she says there's lots of questions. Pace yourself. Okay, Bill Eldridge, can you refresh me on what makes a private city private? That hasn't been spelled out clearly. It seems to be implied that it was small, that it was a small community, and I don't know what the rules are. Whether it was owned by one person originally, or it's just that it was a small community where everybody knew each other. Unclear to me. I'm thinking of the tiny town I grew up in, 200 people if you count the livestock and pets. Is that a private city, or does it come down to who owns the land? I'm just not sure. But what's that famous black and white movie? I can't remember that movie, but I remember that image at the beginning and end of the movie. It was just the one stoplight in the whole town, and it was like unnecessary even to have one traffic light because the town was so small. But I don't know, Bill. I don't know what the answer is. I'm guessing that the town you're describing was a private town. Amy Colessa, which communities of modern Jews observe these Shabbos laws strictly about boundaries and carrying? Well, in terms of carrying, I mean, my community, absolutely. We here in LA, we have a large eruv in terms of a community eruv that joins many neighborhoods together into one extended private domain, and so we can carry on Shabbos. Some people don't hold by the eruv, so you'll see, sort of if you see, Orthodox Jews going to shul, going to synagogue on Shabbos. Some of them will carry their prayer shawl, and some of them are wearing their prayer shawl. The ones who are wearing their prayer shawl as they're walking down the street, it's because they don't hold by the eruv. They don't hold by whoever made it, or for whatever reason, or they just don't believe in the concept of eruv. Some communities don't. And so they won't carry on Shabbos anywhere outside their own property. Other people do. In terms of the Shabbos boundaries, if you live in a city, you're not really affected by it. And so many Jewish communities are lodged in cities, right? So within a city, you can walk throughout the city. It doesn't come into play. But if you live in a kind of smaller town that's out in the country somewhere, then yeah, then if you were trying to get to your friend's house and he's like further out of town than you are, then you're going to be mindful of how far you're walking once you leave the city limits, right? Once you leave the city limits. A question that we haven't asked is, once you're out of the city, but in the Shabbos boundary of the city, can you walk more than 2,000 cubits? Like, because you might cut through that area. I think the answer is, as long as you're within the Shabbos boundary of the city, you can walk anywhere in the Shabbos boundary, but you can't leave the Shabbos boundary of the city, because when you leave that boundary, it means you're already more than 2,000 cubits or more than 2,800 cubits in the corner, but more than the permissible measure of the city in which you began. However, as we've seen, you could move your Shabbos dwelling from the city to somewhere near the edge of the Shabbos boundary, and now you could leave the city, walk to where you establish your Shabbos dwelling, right, your eruv of food, and then you could walk 2,000 more cubits outside the boundary of the city. What you obviously would not be permitted to do is leave the city itself, walking in the other direction, because you've already moved your Shabbos dwelling out of the city itself. Lynn in Texas. Seems like a large town that went through a reducing event might have many abandoned properties and large unused spaces. In fact, this might make the large eruv a problem from earlier discussion. Now, what's interesting is the big city that became a small city, if the buildings are abandoned, but they were residential to begin with, they still count in the city limit, right? And we saw that even if they don't have a roof, as long as there's 3 walls of these former residences, right, the ruins of residences, they do still count. In fact, there was a great article in Ami magazine in the Sukkot issue. Our friend Shlomi Zions, who has been on the AT podcast, visited Dubai. So imagine a Hasidic Jew with his payas, looking like a very religious Jew, and visiting Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. And they just established a new relationship with Israel that's beautiful. And he's made a lot of friends there. He says they're very welcoming and interested in Jews, in Judaism, and learning about it. Anyway, he was sightseeing in the city, and there's like a modern ghost town. For whatever reason, there was a high-end neighborhood with like beautiful contemporary mansions that was abandoned, and now the sand dunes, right, of that desert are sort of overtaking that neighborhood. And it's like these beautiful contemporary mansions half buried in sand. But those are residences, right? So if we were, if we had that situation near a town and they were within 70 cubits of what we might have thought was the city limit, well, they're going to extend the city limit to include those houses, even though nobody lives there anymore. Rochelle Rosen, can you walk to another eruv, walk through that, and then walk another 2,000 cubits, right? So remember that when we're talking about an eruv that's a joining of courtyards, that does not affect the eruv for the purpose of Shabbos limit. These are different ideas. One is joining private domains together so I can carry there. The other is how far from a dwelling I can walk, and a whole city is considered a dwelling for the purposes of how far I can walk. But that doesn't mean that the whole city has joined courtyards so that carrying is permitted throughout the city. Those are different concepts, and it's hard, but we have to keep them separate. So you only have one Shabbos dwelling. It's your Shabbos dwelling, and you measure the 2,000 cubits from that. If your dwelling is in a city, it's the whole city. But as we saw in chapter 4, if a person somehow tried to establish 2 dwellings, if it was done conditionally, that can work. But if it was done by mistake, then he has neither dwelling, and he has to observe the stringencies of both in terms of how far he can walk. Sharon Fran Brooks, how many members or percentage of the community have to concur for a large eruv to happen? Now that's a really good question. We've seen for small eruv, right, that like one person in the courtyard who doesn't want to join in it can really cause problems. If he's there but won't join in, so now we have this whole issue that he's not allowed to carry in the same courtyard that other people are carried in, and that might disqualify the whole eruv. For a large eruv, like the Los Angeles eruv is huge, clearly not every Jew who lives in that eruv and every non-Jew has agreed to it. So how is it that they're able to establish this large eruv acting as agents of the community in order to establish it? And the answer is we actually can't change people's dwelling for the purposes of how far they can walk on Shabbos without their consent. We can't do that because that might be detrimental to them. They might want to go in that direction, and we move their dwelling in that direction, they lose the ability to go where they want to go. But we can join courtyards without a person's conscious consent, because they only gain by being part of such an eruv they can't lose. There's no detriment to them. They might be stubborn and refuse to do it, but there still is an allowance to do it even without their knowledge. How many people have to participate? I don't know the specific rules of that. But LAEruv, LAERUV.org, I think it's not .com. You can Google that, and there's a beautiful explanation by the members of the Sanhedrin, as it were, the members of the Beis Din here in LA, who were instrumental in making that happen. And they were very rigorous with the law, very careful, because it's such a large eruv, and to make it work and make it kosher, they were very careful. And they explain the answer to your question. How many people were represented and how they're represented, and what food constitutes the actual eruv, and they use matzah and where it's stored, and why it works for everybody, but some people refuse to participate in. All these issues are spelled out on that website. Okay, Tom Beck, is it fair to exclude a neighborhood? Like, we have to exclude a small area, right? So we say, fair or not, the sages said we have to do that. So then the question is, well, which neighborhood gets excluded? Did they volunteer for that? I have no idea which neighborhood that gets chosen, how they choose it, just to make this point that the laws of eruv won't be forgotten. I don't know. It's a great question. And finally, Michael Botek says, does an island need an eruv? Oh, that's such a good question. I feel like we've learned something that touches on this. The question is, are partitions needed when there's a body of water? And it's more complicated than one would think, because the seashore and the sea itself is not a public domain. It's actually considered a karpef. And it's neither private nor public for the purposes of carrying, but it's also considered a carmelis, which has properties of both. And so are the partitions needed? I'm not sure. Great question. I'm not sure what the answer is. All right, my friends. Thank you so much for tuning in. This was a somewhat technical discussion, but as you could see here, it's like where the rubber meets the road, right? We've been talking about principles that can be somewhat hypothetical in nature, but somebody's got to get down and spell it out for the residents of a city, and it's going to affect the way that they live on Shabbos. And I'm sure that the people who are involved in that process pray to God for strength and help and guidance and illumination, that they do a good job. The same way I pray for help when I'm teaching, that I shouldn't, make a mistake and mislead people with the error that I make. And when I make errors, I'm happy to be told, just like Rabbi Zera, please let me know so that I can correct the mistakes and let everyone know. We should all have a beautiful last few days of Sukkot, the season of our rejoicing. Tomorrow's Hoshana Rabbah, where we'll be praying essentially for the rain that's going to come in this whole year. We should have enough rain for the crops. We should all be well and prosperous and eat well in the coming year. All the best.